All right, we now get to the government response to Depression and New Deal, part 2 of our look at the Depression of the 1930s. On the left, you see President Hoover, who had the bad luck to be in office when the stock market crash happened in October of 1929, flanked by a couple of his advisors. On the right, at least in one of those segments, you see Franklin Roosevelt, the next president, signing a piece of legislation into law with a number of his close advisors, some of them famous, behind him. Hoover was a conservative Republican, we should know, and we will know soon enough that Franklin Roosevelt was a liberal Democrat. But, as Amity Schlaes, one of the historians quoted in our first slide about interpretation, says, both men were alike in several regards. Both preferred to control events and people. Both underestimated the strength of the American economy. Both doubted its ability to right itself in a storm. Both presidents overestimated the value of government planning. So, I should have said this at the outset of the unit, but I'm going to say it now. It's in this unit where I always choose to emphasize interpretation, something I talk about in the introductory lecture. Perhaps you remember, perhaps you don't, but it's an important part of how history is studied. So it's in this unit where I emphasize that more than any other. So since we're doing this by computer and we're not interacting back and forth, at least while lectures are going on, by email, yes, but you should get in the habit of trying to look at these quotes and, number one, identify the historian and remember, okay, was this the one that was one of the ones that's sort of a pro-New Deal, scholar? Is this one of the ones that's more critical of the New Deal, claiming that it was largely a failure? And then try to understand the quotes from that perspective. And you should always keep in mind then that since the quotes sort of vary, one historian to another, sometimes it was a couple, that they're coming from different perspectives and kind of a hodgepodge of slides. So this statement is a good one to start with. That's what reminded me of it, because everything she says here is open to argument. It could be true, by the way. Argument. If it's open to argument, it means it could be true on either side. So she could be right, and she offers evidence and reasonable argument in her book. I've read it, but did the presidents here underestimate the strength of the American economy? It had collapsed. So that's open to question. So just keep in mind that not all of the quotes will be as open to our argument. Some of them are more factual in nature, but this is certainly an interpretive quotation. Look for them as we go along. The Hoover Administration's efforts and public opinion. So Hoover's a controversial president. He can't be blamed for the stock market crashing while he was in office. I mean, he could a little bit, I suppose, but that doesn't make much sense. But what does make sense is holding him accountable for policies that he undertook once the crash happened and the Depression ensued, or policies that he failed to enact. Did he do enough? Did he not do enough? Those are the kind of questions that get asked, and there's a wide array of answers, again, depending on the historian's viewpoint. So Kim Phillips Fine, in a fairly new book called Invisible Hands, The Businessman's Crusade Against the New Deal, says President Hoover, always confident in the ability of reasonable men to solve any problem, initially treated the crisis as a matter of public relations. He held conferences at the White House where he begged them to maintain wage rates and hold payroll steady, meaning begged businessmen. So what she's getting at is that he underestimated the problem, treated it like, it's just a PR problem, and kind of fix it, and thought that if I can just talk to businessmen and convince them to keep prices high or wages high, payroll steady, then we'll be fine. Remember that Hoover had a successful career in linking public sector and private sector activity, using government to not force businesses and the private sector to do things, but to try to sort of do things in partnership. He started his career by, or at least, became known, got on the map as a sort of important person for the first time in World War I when he successfully collected relief funds for war-torn Europe. So he had an enduring sort of a career filled with success in getting the private sector to solve problems. And so he seems to have thought that that could work to some degree. He did use the government. He did, as we'll see. But whether he did it enough, I think, is open to question. Professor Rourke, our beloved textbook author, says Hoover was no do-nothing president, but there were limits to his conception of the government's proper role in fighting the economic disaster. He compared direct federal aid to the needy, meaning the poor, to the dole in Britain. Dole means like welfare, which he thought destroyed the moral fiber of the chronically unemployed. So the point here, Professor Rourke, generally pretty objective here, but is saying, well, it's possible that he could be criticized because though he understood the government needed to get involved, he still had his own kind of personal, philosophical sort of problems that caused him to not go as far as he maybe could have gone. So he believed that aid to the poor, the unemployed, destroyed kind of their morale. It sort of destroyed their work ethic. It destroyed their incentive to move forward. So that his own economic and personal philosophy may have limited his response in a way that could have hurt the chance at a quick solution, or at least setting in motion a solution to this problem. But again, to show us that Hoover did some substantial, made some substantial moves, with the government, that it wasn't all him trying to reach out to the private sector. We get, and this is the most famous and I think the biggest government effort on his administration's part, though not the only one, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation of 1931. Offered government credit to banks, other financial institutions, and that was hoped anyway that what that would do was in turn loosen credit in the whole economy and stimulate economic recovery. So he was using an institution that was designed to help prop up banks with credit to hopefully radiate out into the larger economy by loosening up interest rates and loans everywhere, which would stimulate the economy as a whole in an upward direction again. Did it succeed? Not entirely, but keep in mind that Hoover was out of office by the next election, as we'll see, and so who knows? Because the New Dealers, Franklin Roosevelt's advisors and technocrats and policy wonks that sort of come in, policy designers that come in, they actually, many of them, complimented the Reconstruction Finance Corporation after the fact. So we got a lot of our good ideas from Hoover's program and his Hoover's guys that have designed this. So this is a sign or an example of something that Hoover did do in a positive, assertive way, using the government, getting a government program through and in position to try to attack the Depression. However, it's, I think, almost unanimous amongst historians, and maybe it is unanimous, that his signing and support of the SmootHawley Tariff in 1931 was an absolute disaster. In retrospect, and it was clear to some people even then, the world needed to stay open to trade, free trade or something as close to it as possible. And not only did that not happen in the world, but the SmootHawley Tariff here, named after the two congressmen that pushed it, or that authored the bill, not only did that not happen worldwide, but it's this tariff that sort of led the way. It's when other countries started to see, or did see, this tariff come out, that they started erecting tariff barriers themselves and protecting their own countries from foreign goods coming in. And so the real problem here was that it caused, and it was predictable that it would cause other countries to retaliate by raising their tariff rates. And as Amity Schley says again, for the general economy, the tariff was bad news. A new tariff would shut U.S. sellers off from the world at a time when they badly needed new customers. it would hurt or just customers. It would hurt other nations that the U.S. hoped would become its markets. It would certainly hurt the worker. Workers in industries that relied on exports were going to for sure be hurt by this. And yet, because some business interests, for reasons won't get into, supported it, and I'm not sure what the other reasons are. Hoover made one of the most disastrous decisions of the entire Depression. So there's no doubt this has to be put as sort of a strike against his leadership. I'm sure his intentions were good, but this ended up being a disaster. I know one current, very well-respected economist who thinks that the SmootHawley Tariff is the biggest cause of the Depression. Among those economists that think that the stock market crash in and of itself didn't guarantee a depression, it's this that guaranteed the Depression. That's one economist, but he's quite famous. Fear itself. In his inaugural address, his first inaugural, Franklin Roosevelt said famously, maybe his most famous statement ever, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Roosevelt came to office with a number of qualities that were quite different from his predecessor. He had won the Democratic nomination in 1932 and squared off then against Hoover in Hoover's re-election bid. And he was, I think, almost bound to defeat him. I'll go back to this for a second. Hoover was a super smart guy, right? We've seen him have an extremely successful career. He was a great and powerful cabinet member under presidents. He was a smart guy, well-educated, degree from Stanford, engineer. He was honest. He was hardworking. He had a lot of good ideas, but he did, I think, have some personal limitations or some quirks that got in his way. One of them was stubbornness. Another one, I think, was he tended to stick to his philosophy. He stuck to his approach to the Depression, which was government involvement, but limited enough to allow the private sector, business, to try to take care of some of the, solve some of the problems of the Depression itself, which might not have been enough, might not have worked. It might have needed a more robust government response. At least that's one side. Some actually say he didn't. That he himself went too far, so that even his government programs were too much, and the New Deals went even further than that. So again, this gets down to a matter of interpretation again. But he was pretty stubborn and sort of stuck to his guns. So when his programs weren't working, at least there were no tangible results. In fact, the economic statistics started to get worse as his presidency continued. He started to become increasingly unpopular with the public. He didn't look confident any longer. He looked befuddled. He looked frustrated. He looked stubborn. In the bottom left, you see a shanty town, and there were hundreds of these across the countries, and they got lovingly named Hoovervilles. Pretty soon that became the popular name for these things. Hoover. I don't know who first started it, but pretty soon everybody's calling these things Hoovervilles. And it sounds like no big deal, but think about it. If you're driving by in a car, right, by one of these sort of shanty town tent colonies, shacks, and you drive, look, Mom, there's a Hooverville there, right? Without even thinking about it, if you say that, it's like, wow. Americans have gotten, and this is what happened, they've gotten so used to calling these things Hooverville that they've sort of forgotten that they're sort of talking about what they're saying is it's President Hoover and his policies or lack thereof that have sort of caused America, forced America into this kind of desperation, at least for many Americans. So this was a public relations disaster that these things got named Hooverville. Nobody was behind it, as far as I know. It just sort of evolved into it. But what a nightmare for the president. So with these kind of things happening, no wonder that it looked bad for any chances of his reelection. Making it even worse for himself, in part, was the bonus army, which we'll talk about more later on. and you see a photograph of this at the bottom. He had the U.S. Army by force roused veterans of World War I who were living in unoccupied buildings in Washington, D.C., who were there to protest around Congress to get Congress to give them their pensions early because they were desperate during the Great Depression, and they were frustrated at not getting their way. Hoover was worried that they were going to start rioting, and so he sent the military out. And the military went overboard more than he wanted them to. So he didn't want it to end up with violence, and it wasn't like a massive amount of violence, but it was a terrible look. And so yet again, with kind of overreaction from his army officer that he put in charge, it's going to be laying at his doorstep, and it was. So with these kind of things, Hoovervilles, the bonus army, disaster, it's going to be increasingly difficult for him to win re-election. And he was up against a candidate that was a nightmare for anyone to come up against. Franklin Roosevelt had lots of ability and lots of skills. As John Meacham, one of America's premier historians today, says, he possessed dignified theatricality, an essential element of power. Great leaders are often great performers, able to articulate national purposes and hopes, projecting strength and resolve in moments that threaten to give way to weakness and despair. That might be laying it a little bit too thick, but Roosevelt definitely had gifts, political gifts. He had rhetorical gifts and more. But that wasn't necessarily always pleasant. He could be quite a manipulative politician, a manipulative person as well. But he did make for someone that was difficult to best in political competition. It's been talked about quite a bit in biographies on him, how his background helps explain his performance in office as well. The two most important characteristics that tend to come up is, one, that he was willing to experiment. He was an experimenter kind of by nature, meaning he didn't have a set political philosophy, especially with regard to how to deal with the Depression. So he came in kind of with an open mind and a willingness to kind of try different things. And that he did. Remember, Hoover had kind of one approach to the Depression and refused to change it. So Hoover was a bit more set in his ways, stubborn. Franklin Roosevelt a bit more open to trying new and different things. Now, I'm not saying for sure that was a good thing. Amity Shlaes, we've already quoted a number of times, probably the most critical scholar with regard to Roosevelt's New Deal and his approach to the presidency and solving the problem of the Depression, says that, and already did in one of the quotes, that his willingness to experiment frightened business people. Markets tend to like, predictability, and he made things unpredictable because they never knew he was going to sort of pull something new out of nowhere from some, advisor that came up with a new idea, a new plan, and put it into, play and experiment with it. Experiment, it can sound good, and it can be read that way, but wait a minute, you're experimenting with the economy in the middle of a depression. What if your experiment goes awry? What if the next experiment goes awry? You're playing with lives and livelihoods in all this. Nonetheless, it was one of the characteristics that I do think explains how he did get things done, whether they worked or were successful or not, open to interpretation. He also came to office with an infectious confidence. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, legendary Supreme Court justice, who is around still here for a time, said that Roosevelt had a second-rate intellect but a first-class temperament. So he didn't mean he was an idiot, by the way. He wasn't an idiot. But he's saying, you guy's not brilliant, but he has a first-class temperament. He can sort of handle any situation calmly, coolly, confidently. He can sort of, he has a winning personality. He can get people to sort of do what he wants by charming them, etc., etc. One of the ways that came out most famously is in his fireside chats. On several occasions during the Great Depression, he took advantage of radio, a rather new technology, and reached out to Americans and gave speeches in ways that were quite moving and quite effective for people. We'll see that again in a moment. William Leuchtenberg, really a proponent of Roosevelt's approach to the Depression and the New Deal, said that his call for sacrifice, discipline, and action demonstrated he was a man confident in his powers as leader of the nation. In claiming there was nothing to fear but fear, he made his greatest single contribution to the politics of the 1930s, the installation of hope and courage in the people. He made clear that the time of waiting was over, that he had the people's interest at heart, and that he would mobilize the power of the government to help them. Roosevelt moved swiftly. On his very first night in office, he directed the Secretary of the Treasury to draft an emergency banking bill and gave him less than 5 days to deliver it. So he came in aggressively and moved quickly, although that could be said to have been not a good thing either. That if you move quickly, you're likely to make more mistakes. However, the public, I think, did eat this up, and there is no doubt or little doubt that he did install a great deal of hope and sort of put a shot of courage back into the American public. With him confidently, seemingly in control, Americans tended to feel better. Whether they should have felt better or not is open to question, but he definitely made many Americans feel, okay, this guy's taking control. He's taking charge. I think something good's going to come out of it. With regard to his own tendency to experiment, he said, frankly, it's common sense to try it. Take a method, try it. If it fails, admit it frankly, and try another. But above all, try something. We need enthusiasm, imagination, and the ability to face facts, even unpleasant ones, bravely. And there's much to be said for that statement and that mentality. It's just that it's with this crisis, when you're talking about something as gigantic as the American economy failing, it's not easy to figure out what the answers are to questions like what worked, what didn't work, how did the country get out of the Depression, how did it get in the Depression. These are really, really difficult questions. The New Deal, his eventual program of laws, government agencies, attempts to solve the crisis of the Depression, put out the various fires created by it, starts in 1933, his first year in office. The New Deal really is, for a long time, has been sort of the centerpiece of historians studying the Great Depression, partly because he was in office for much longer of the Depression than was Hoover, and because his New Deal was much more aggressive than Hoover's approach. A lot of focus gets sort of placed on the New Deal. Not I think, wrongly. It's just, it does become like kind of the centerpiece, sometimes to the exclusion of other elements of the Depression. Back to that idea later on. The phrase "the New Deal," we know already that other presidents had sort of beat him to the punch, one of them being his namesake and distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, in naming sort of their package and pieces of legislation, kind of putting an umbrella around them, wrapping them together with a catchy name, So Square Deal, and we saw also Woodrow Wilson with the New Freedom, and now we see New Deal. There's still some debate about who came up with the phrase on his campaign, but this came out during one and then another of his speeches during the election campaign of 1932 when he was first running for office. And when he first used the phrase New Deal, he used it kind of vaguely, and it doesn't appear that he really had a program in mind behind it. It just was sort of a winning-sounding phrase. It's only, I think, over time that, and once he got into office, that his advisors and he started to think, this is the actual phrase we're going to keep using to label this whole package of reforms and laws we're going to put into place. So this then, as the centerpiece really of scholars' attention on the Great Depression, obviously is a place where there's lots of interpretation. Robert McIlvaine, and we're starting from the statements most supportive of, those that are defending Roosevelt's New Deal, thinking it was a good thing for America, to those less convinced, to, at the bottom, those not convinced. Robert McIlvaine says it was the most remarkable legislative accomplishment any American president has ever made. So nothing but unstinting praise there, at least in that statement. And his book is from that perspective. Leuchtenberg, a little bit older of a book, but also has a tendency to see the New Deal in positive terms. The New Dealers displayed striking ingenuity in meeting the problems of governing. For the first time for many Americans, the federal government became an institution that was directly experienced, meaning that it was kind of in their daily lives for the first time. More than state and local governments, it came to be the government. So we'll just talk about the government as the U.S. government. They'd never really done that before. An agency directly concerned with their own welfare. It was the source of their relief payments. It taxed them directly for old age pensions. It even gave their children hot lunches in school. Its relief programs represented an advance over the barbaric pre-Depression practices that constituted a difference not in degree, but in kind. This growth in federal government owed much to the fact that local and state had been tried in the crisis and found wanting. So Leuchtenberg is there saying that part of the reason that this worked and looked so good, felt so good to Americans, is because the local and state governments had tried sort of relief programs, to alleviate the suffering of the Depression, and they hadn't done very well. And so, next to them, the federal government looked much better with its, much larger resources and ability to get things done if and when they have a government and a president with the will to do so, and now they do. Stephen Knott, who we know has taken kind of a middle position on the success of the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal, said this was an ambitious agenda designed to restore the confidence of the American public. And it was an ambitious agenda, and it did restore the confidence of the American public, and Knott understands that. And he's actually, Stephen Knott, the historian in question here, is fairly favorably disposed himself to Roosevelt's New Deal, but he criticizes a lot of other elements of his presidency during this period, as we'll see, and even after into World War II. Amity Schley's the most critical of the historians on our list of scholars here, created regulatory that the New Deal created regulatory aid and relief agencies based on the premise that recovery could be achieved only through a large military-style effort. Some of these were useful, some were inspiring. Other new institutions did damage. And I'm repeating this one because it fits here as well. So was the New Deal a success? Was it a failure? You decide. As far as the intellectual context of the New Deal is concerned, I think it's somewhat important to sort of give some context because of the magnitude of what we're talking about here, which takes us back to the progressive era. Franklin Roosevelt tended to think, like Woodrow Wilson before him, as we saw in one quote, that the Constitution needed to be changed. I mean, not necessarily go in and erase it and put pen in new lines or actually type up new pages, but to interpret it differently or avoid the Constitution in some ways. And a lot of progressive politicians like Wilson and thinkers of the earlier era, some of them still around, were of the same ilk. Progressive scholars, quoting now Stephen Knott again, such as J. Allen Smith and Charles A. Beard, were the public intellectuals of their day who shifted academic thinking on the American founding, and the founding fathers, the Constitution, its original writing, and the Constitution in an entirely new direction. The Constitution blocked the ability of social movements to secure change and thus had to go, according to that progressive train of thought. These men and other progressive scholars provided the intellectual underpinnings of the New Deal. Their ideas seeped down into the mainstream thinking as they always do, and were welcomed by populist and progressive forces frustrated with judicial objections and the cumbersome nature of separation of powers. So a fancy way to say that Charles A. Beard, an historian, one of the most famous ever in American history, was of the opinion, and Roosevelt comes along and agrees and is influenced by this type of thinking, that the Constitution, if it gets in the way of the will of the American people and the president trying to carry out the will of the American people, then the Constitution must be shoved aside. That separation of powers, meaning like the judicial branch of government, the Supreme Court, must be swept aside. As long as the president's got the popular support of the public behind him, right, through elections and winning elections, then those things should not be allowed to get in his way, which may sound unobjectionable to you, and it may be, but there's, I think, some real reason to stop and think about that before you nod and say, well, he's right. And plenty of Americans thought Roosevelt a hero for doing exactly those things, which he did. He didn't just take this philosophy, this way of thinking to heart. He acted on it. He does shove aside the Constitution in more than one case, or at least tries to. He does try to sort of bend the Supreme Court to his will in an unconstitutional way, or at least in a questionably constitutional way. And the public tended to love it because they saw the other elements of government as obstructionists, getting in the way of Roosevelt solving their problems through more aggressive attack on the problems in the economy. So who crafted the New Deal legislation? A group, actually a couple of groups, that became collectively known as the Brains Trust. We usually use the word, I think, brain trust, but at the time in the papers and in the media, it generally was called Brains Trust, maybe because there were two of them. The first Brains Trust from the first New Deal were mainly, not completely, but three of the big names you see on the left were Columbia University law professors and social science professors. And then later, in the second New Deal, a couple years later, it switched over to Harvard. Not necessarily sort of officially. These were always unofficial advisors, a kitchen cabinet of sorts, led by Felix Frankfurter, a brilliant law professor from Harvard, who Roosevelt later appointed as one of the Supreme Court justices, and he appoints a number of justices. I don't know if we mentioned this in class before, and again, I should have said this at the outset of talking about Roosevelt himself, but Franklin D. Roosevelt won 4 times won the presidential election 4 times. In those days, there was not a constitutional amendment that said you can't run for, you can't win the presidency more than twice. You have to step down after 2 terms. That wasn't in place. It is true that until Roosevelt, all previous presidents had adhered to the precedent set by George Washington, the first president, who retired willingly after 2 terms. So out of respect for Washington, out of respect for the system, all right, to not look too like they want power too much, all presidents until Franklin Roosevelt stepped down after their 2nd term. Roosevelt did not. And he ran for a 3rd term and won, and ran for a 4th term and won. However, he died fairly early in his 4th term, near the end of World War II. But that makes him by far the longest-serving president in our history, 12-plus years in the White House. And Roosevelt is usually considered one of our greatest presidents. Not everybody agrees. Some of the historians quoted here, I'm sure, don't. And I'm kind of agnostic on it myself. But he did steer the country, whether successfully in the case of the Great Depression or not, through not just one, but 2 of its greatest crises ever. The Great Depression, and a little thing called World War II. And on that, I think it's much harder, World War II, which we get to in the next unit, it's much harder to give him a poor grade for his leadership in World War II. It's a bit easier here, though he may deserve a high grade here as well. So from the Blue Eagles to the hot dogs. Blue Eagle is a reference to one of the early New Deal programs that these guys basically authored, or one of them did. Hot dogs, of course, is a reference to the second group of brains trust guys from Harvard, and their leader, Felix Frankfurter. Get it? Hot dog. Frankfurter, one of the most successful immigrants to the country ever, of Austrian birth, and came to the United States and became a law professor and a justice of the Supreme Court. So the Blue Eagles were sort of the first brain trust on the left, and helped craft legislation to the first New Deal. Hot dogs. I don't know if there's ever a softball game between the Blue Eagles and the hot dogs, but there should have been. Hot dogs sort of came in and sort of designed, crafted a lot of the agencies and legislation for the second New Deal. Wilfred McClay, in his overview of American history, says, with the assistance of Raymond Moley, one of the guys on the left there, one of the Blue Eagles, Roosevelt had assembled a brain trust of top experts in various aspects of public policy. But they all had different and sometimes conflicting ideas. Some wanted stricter enforcement of antitrust laws affecting commerce. Others wanted to see such laws waived to make possible greater concentration and collaboration between the private sector and the government possible. Others wanted to see massive wealth transfers through social welfare programs to even out some of the grosser disparities in the society and enabling the relief of suffering individuals and family. But this quote I like because it tells us something we've already really seen, and that is that Roosevelt liked to experiment. So he didn't want a staff of people that all agreed on everything. He thrived on this kind of thing where it's like, I got a lot of different ideas from different directions. They disagree a lot of times, and then I can kind of pick and choose what I think we should try. And if one doesn't work, then I'll take the next guy's idea that I rejected the first time and put that into place. And so there wasn't really any real common philosophy over all this, at least not from Roosevelt's point of view. Some of these individuals had their own, sort of personal, political, policy philosophy, but it would differ with one of the other guys that was an advisor or part of the brain trust as well. We mentioned the fireside chats before. This relatively new technology, Roosevelt was really the first politician to master. He might have been the first person to master it. He was so good at it. But in the fireside chats, he sat down in front of the network microphones and was broadcast into the homes of millions of Americans who tuned in live, breathlessly awaiting the president. And he seemed to intuitively understand that it wouldn't work, since this is, again, a fairly new technology. It wouldn't work if he spoke the same way that he did when in front of an assembly, in front of speaking at an auditorium somewhere. That it needed to sound like he was sitting there next to you, talking to you in your house. So William Lichtenberg says, Roosevelt was the first president to master the technique of reaching the people directly over radio. In the fireside chats, he talked like a father discussing public affairs with his family in the living room. And that is the impression that Americans got. If you read the documents from the time over and over and over again, people felt like this guy was a father. Remember, he made the country feel better about itself. He made people feel more hopeful and more confident. Whether they should have been more confident, he made them feel that way nonetheless. And so you can say he did, he saved what otherwise would have been even greater anxiety and angst by sort of calming people's fears, at least to some degree. He definitely did that, and that in itself, I think, is an inarguable positive, unless you want to say that he was, misleading them or giving them false hope. But I don't think that's very likely. I mean, it's not likely that holds up. His wife is one of the most famous first ladies of all time. In some ways, kind of defined what a first lady is supposed to be, at least ideally, because she was a hard act to follow. Eleanor Roosevelt, by the way, that was her maiden name too, Roosevelt. What? They were cousins, and I know that everyone's gasping right now, and I get it. I don't disagree with you, but in those days it actually wasn't uncommon, especially for the rich. and Roosevelt, both of them came from an old money, wealthy family. So that they ended up getting married. It was really common in those days. Let me say something else. Again, sometimes I think of things that I wanted to say earlier or was going to say later. I call audibles in the middle of a lecture. You already know that. Roosevelt, some of you may know, went through a huge personal crisis earlier in his career when he was a state-level politician in New York State and already married to Eleanor. He contracted polio, and in those days, polio was a very debilitating illness. It's basically been wiped out now because of modern medicine, and it's around a little bit once in a while in some countries, but it's basically been eradicated. But it basically made Roosevelt disabled for the rest of his life. He couldn't walk and had to use crutches or be carried or be helped. And it's incredible that he continued his career at all, because being a politician, particularly the president, is a very physically as well as mentally taxing job. You're up and around and have to be at this meeting and waving, meeting the public and shaking hands and waving and speaking constantly. And he'd been a very physical politician before, jumping out of his car and running out to people to shake their hands on election campaigns, and kind of a tall, kind of athletic guy as a young man. But this totally changed his lifestyle in some ways, but he hardly missed a beat when it came to sort of the energy that he poured into his political career, and though it must have for sure caused depression and sadness on his part, he never let it show and didn't let it slow down his sort of at least projected optimism sort of outwards. It also may have given him a certain amount of compassion that he hadn't had before, a certain ability to kind of understand other people's suffering because he now knows what it's like to suffer. And I say that partly because biographers have talked about this as well. He came from a wealthy background, as I mentioned, but he also was an only child. And so he grew up like never wanting anything. He had everything he needed. His mother showered him with attention and affection and love. And so this kid grew up knowing hardly any problems whatsoever. And so had he never run into any kind of personal crisis, and this is a major personal crisis to contract, have to live with polio the rest of your life, it may have sort of changed. He may have never evolved into a president that was going to do something like a New Deal. Not that Roosevelt was the most touchy-feely guy in the world. Not that he wasn't doing most of these New Deal programs based on any deeply held philosophical or moral principles. So I wouldn't push that too far, but it does get remarked on by biographers quite a bit. So with regard to Eleanor, Robert McIlvaine says an important political asset to her husband was she. Franklin and Eleanor were a winning team. Their strengths complemented each other. Her compassion was a match for his ambition, and over the years, each of their qualities began to rub off on the other spouse. Eleanor Roosevelt was at least as widely perceived as her husband as a person who genuinely cared for the fate of others. Her general compassion for the downtrodden, helping others, made her feel needed. So she was an extremely active First Lady, oftentimes doing things on her own. She held press conferences on her own, was the first First Lady to ever do so, and promoted the careers of women journalists by inviting only them sometimes to her press conferences to cover the conference. She got involved in all kinds of programs, and sometimes in the private sector, to deal with people suffering at the local or state level in the Great Depression. She traveled around the country, often without the president, and was sometimes his eyes and ears, as it says on the screen, because he couldn't get around, at least as easily. Not that, of course, he never traveled. He went to Europe during World War II a number of times, but he didn't get around as easily. Now, he had plenty of other advisors that could be his eyes and ears too, and they certainly were, meaning they could travel and report back to him, and did. But she had unique access to the president because she's his wife. So she could not only go out and see things and experience things that he didn't and come back and report it, she'd come back and report it directly to his face whenever she wanted to, because she's his wife. And she tended to have a great deal of a sway in older age. During Franklin's Roosevelt's presidency, she tended to kind of point her finger at him, wave her, Franklin, like you're going to do that, you're going to do it this way. So she ended up being kind of like his moral compass. He tended to decide, sort of issues based on, the political calculation, and she added sort of the moral element and waved her finger and said, Franklin, you better not do that. You got to do this. It's the right thing to do. And again, as it says from the quote, they kind of rubbed off on each other. The qualities of each rubbed off on the other one. By the way, their marriage was in many ways a political marriage. There wasn't a lot of passion in the marriage, especially after he was caught cheating on her, and she almost divorced him. And they kind of agreed. She sort of made him agree, if I'm going to stay in this marriage after what you've done, I'm going to be a free agent. I'll show up to all the public appearances, like you see in the lower right, and do all that. But on my own time, I'm going to come and go as I please. And he agreed to it. So they had, in some ways, what you call kind of a distant marriage. But I think, and again, this is coming from lots of reading I've done on this subject and these two people, that they generally had genuine love and respect for each other, just not really of the romantic kind. But I think that love and respect deepened over the years. We now switch to a person that's important for a different reason, though a crucial figure in this whole global crisis. And by the way, something else I'm mentioning for the first time, the Great Depression was a global depression. This wasn't just the worst depression in American history, it was the worst one in world history. So this gives us a little better chance at understanding how a British economist named John Maynard Keynes became such an influential figure here and elsewhere. Well, Britain was going through the Depression, maybe not quite as badly as the U.S., although it was hit pretty hard as well. Many historians have argued, and they could be right, that the two countries hit the hardest by the Depression were Germany and the United States, and they were related to each. Those, if that's true, it's because they were related to each other economically in ways that we'll get to when we talk about World War II. So John Maynard Keynes was a brilliant economist. He's considered one of the great economic thinkers in all of the history of this subject. So if you ever read a book or take a class on the history of economic thought or economic theory, there'll be a whole unit or a whole chapter on John Maynard Keynes. There are still Keynesian economists to this day, lots of them. And there are lots of economists that hate Keynesian economics and completely disagree with it. So Keynes, kind of like Franklin Roosevelt himself, is a very controversial figure, though he's been deceased for many decades, like Franklin D. Roosevelt. By the way, that's saying something. If somebody's still controversial, like well after they've died, in my opinion, they've done something right. Like, wow. Wouldn't I could only like hope and pray and dream that long after I'm gone, that people are still debating me, and some hating me, and some on my side. Talk about an accomplishment. So Keynes is still talked about to this day. I'm simplifying Keynesian theory as a brilliant economist. We could get much more, or someone could talk about this subject in much more detail, in much more technical ways than I can. Though I've read a lot about Keynes and I've read a little bit of his work, so I understand it pretty well. But I'm not an economist, as you know. But Keynesian theory, at least with regard to the Great Depression, is in a sense asking the question, can you spend your way out of a depression? Or as the British called it, a slump. You see that in the upper left, the word slump. I love that word. We should use the word slump instead of depression. I just like it much better. The Great Slump. So it's counterintuitive, if it's correct, that, so wait a minute. So you're in an economic crisis, you're in a depression, and you're going to start spending more money? Shouldn't you be saving more money? Well, that would be the conventional wisdom. And Keynes goes against the conventional wisdom. And at the time, it really was going against the conventional wisdom. But to show you how influential this person was, after this, and after playing a significant role in economic policy in World War II, especially right at the end of World War II, and by that time he was world famous and renowned, Keynesian economics became the dominant form of economics at the universities for the next number of decades. So between, say, 1945, the end of World War II, and about the 1970s, about a 30-year period, Keynesian economics dominated, long after he was gone and passed away in 1946. It's only after that that you started to see a school or a number of schools of, I don't mean literal schools, colleges, but schools of thought at universities and colleges that started to counter and take on and successfully challenge Keynesian economics. But it's still a branch of economics, as I said before today, that holds its own with its opponents. So his answer to the question, can you spin your way out, was, of course, yes. And there had been some conventional wisdom, one piece of it specifically here, that an economy, a capitalist economy, is self-regulating, meaning that it doesn't need government intervention because when it goes either too high, heats up too much, or goes sort of to the bottom in a crash, a recession, a depression, there are these natural mechanisms that are already in the economy that sort of kick in. And the big one was interest rates. And so he studied this and didn't study it just in this book, but this is kind of his magnum opus, and so he talks about it here as well, interest rates, in his great book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which was published right in the middle of the Depression in 1936. But he wrote some of the things before that that was already sort of moving his thinking in this direction. So all the way back to, let's say, just in our class, remember the Depression of the 1890s. Grover Cleveland was president, and he basically thought the government's job isn't to be involved. He even said the government's job is not to, take care of you, right? We're not there to take care of the people. So that was partly based on the traditional, conventional wisdom that the economy will fix itself. Just step out of the way. You don't have to be patient and wait. There might be some suffering, but it'll right itself. The ship will right itself. But the key mechanism that we didn't mention before was always seen to be traditionally interest rates. And it's true that when savings go up, interest rates go down. And so the conventional thinking on this was that, well, in a time of economic crisis, people know that it could get worse. They might lose their jobs if they haven't already. So they start stuffing money away in their savings in the bank to have there in case things get worse. And so if that's true, what is true for sure, as I already said, is that if savings grow in banks, interest rates go down. Why? Well, when banks have lots of money, right, because people are depositing lots of money, then they feel freer to offer loans at less interest because they're so flush with cash. When they have less money sitting in their banks, they're not as comfortable with that and loaning it out, so they charge higher interest rates to do so. So if an economic downturn comes along, everyone starts saving more money, hoarding their cash, to save for the rainy day. Then savings goes up, which means interest rates go down. Again, that part's true. So why would that matter? Well, because with the lower interest rates, then the conventional thinking was that consumers, but mostly businesses, will take advantage of the low interest rates and start a new business, or take out a loan and build a new factory that provides 500 new jobs, etc., etc., and that will help get the economy going again, because there'll be more employment, more jobs, more more workers who get a paycheck, there'll be more consumers, and it'll get things moving in the right direction again. So it all sounds well and good, except that what Keynes concluded was that the conventional wisdom was wrong. Savings couldn't have gone up in this depression, and they wouldn't likely go up in any recession or depression, but especially this one, the world's biggest ever. And if you think about it, it's, I think, pretty clear that he was right. One of the reasons we don't know this for sure is they didn't have the plethora of economic statistics kept that they do today. They had some, but not like we do today. So it wasn't always easy to know what the savings sort of rate was in a country. But I think it stands to reason, and you know, once he sort of was the first one to think of this, it became obvious, at least to many, seemed obvious to many, that it doesn't make sense. If you're in the middle of a depression, you don't have much money coming in, you can't save any money. You want to. I mean, it makes sense that you would want to, and you should, but you can't because all your money is going out to buy basic necessities. Right? You have so little money coming in. One person in your family got laid off. You got reduced to half hours. Blah blah blah. You're not saving money. You'll be lucky if you're, even breaking even every month. So why would savings go up? And then if that's true that they're not going up, then interest rates wouldn't go down, which then it wouldn't provide an extra incentive for people to take out business loans because of the low interest rates, and so it would blow up the entire idea that there's a natural self-regulating mechanism in the economy that'll sort of bring it back to health again after it kind of crashes. And so he concluded that in the middle of the screen here, the economy could get stuck at what we call the bottom of the trough, meaning that since there's not a self-regulating mechanism in his mind that would sort of buoy it back up again, the economy could crash and sort of get stuck in recession or depression and just stay there indefinitely. And there's no mechanism that says on its own it's going to improve itself. He also, in a sense, was saying, why would anyone want a business loan now anyway? Even if it's true that savings are going up and interest rates then would naturally go down, who cares if you got money loaned at you at 0%? Why would you open a new shoe store in the middle of the Great Depression? It wouldn't make much sense. And I think what he's saying on that does make quite a bit of sense here. So his solution was priming the pump. Again, the language that he used, and what he meant was that the only entity big enough with enough money to sort of kickstart the economy was the national government. The United States, the federal government, his country, the British government, and they had to start sort of a counter-cyclical, also as he labeled it, sort of policy of deficit spending. So much money is needed to prime the pump of a modern economy that you can't just do it through taxation. You've got to do it by debt. You got to go into debt to do it. And here's where it really gets controversial, especially now, since Keynes is not considered to be, sort of the standalone, expert in all this stuff any longer. He's got a lot of opposition, but he's saying not just that the government has to spend a lot of money. Right? Can you spin your way out of a depression? He's saying yes. Not only that, you can and should do it by going into huge amounts of debt. Wait a minute. We're already in a huge economic crisis, and you want the government to go into debt and spend money that doesn't have leverage, the future? And he's saying yes. His belief, Keynesian economists today's belief, is that in times of crisis, economic crisis, you have to spend and go into debt to do it. And when the economy gets good again, then you pay it off. And sort of it keeps kind of going back and forth like that from crisis to crisis. So the government has to kickstart the economy, and another way to say it would be inject demand into the system. So you have to get people working again so that they have a paycheck, and that paycheck then, when they bring it home, causes them to become consumers, and they go out and buy things from stores and hardware stores and grocery stores, and that then causes the businesses, the corporations, the manufacturers to start producing stuff again. And counter-cyclical. Remember we talked about the vicious downward spirals, especially the deflationary spiral. It's the hardest one to deal with, the most important one. This is what it's designed to do. Counter-cyclical basically means getting that spiral to go back up again. Right? People got laid off. from their jobs because there was no spending power, which then caused them to not be able to buy products, and which caused their employers to cut production even more, lay off more people, on down and down it went, as we've already noted. He's saying we have to get it going in the other direction again, and to do that, you have to get money in the hands of the consumer, and they've got to put it into the economy by buying sort of the basics, and get then the businesses, the corporations, to start producing products again. So this is Keynes' economic theory. Now, what does it have to do with the New Deal and the Great Depression? Well, Keynes' thought was already pretty well known, certainly even across the United States. Many economists and a lot of Roosevelt's team of New Dealers, some of them lawyers, some of them economists, some of them bureaucrats. Not all of them were well versed in Keynesian theory. Some of them were. Some of them had him, knew who he was. Roosevelt knew who he was. He'd spoken to him before. But it's not accurate to say that Keynes had a direct effect necessarily on New Deal policy. He had an indirect effect for sure, because enough of the New Deal types, the brain trust guys and their assistants had familiarity with him or more, that his ideas were in the air. There were some New Deal figures that later swore that the policies they put into place that basically were based on Keynesian economics, they swore they knew nothing about Keynes or knew very little about him, which could be true because somebody else came up with the same idea from somewhere else. They didn't necessarily have to get it from Keynes. Nonetheless, he had a big indirect effect on American policymaking and thinking that went into the New Deal. So we get to now Roosevelt's first days in office and what's sometimes called the first New Deal. And famously, he set off on a tear. Remember, this guy took charge quickly, got aggressive, started trying different things, experimenting. And so his first 3 months or so in office is sometimes, or now is always referred to as the 100 days. It's become legendary for its aggressiveness in getting things passed into law. It certainly helped him that both houses of Congress, because of the Depression, because of Americans' dissatisfaction with the Hoover and Republican administrations before, elected majority of Democrats, Roosevelt's party, to Congress. So Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, making it easier for Franklin Roosevelt to operate. So that had a big part of it. The alphabet soup of the New Deal, alphabet soup because so many of these things became acronyms. Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, National Recovery Act, NRA. So know your acronyms in this unit. One of our authors says the 100 days was a thrilling period from Adolph Burrell, the expert on corporations, to Francis Perkins, the pioneering social reformer, to Rexford Tugwell, the economic planner. The New Dealers displayed the kind of dynamism from which today's moribund politicians might learn. So she's ripping into today's politicians, saying they don't have the same dynamism and the same sort of energy and ability that their predecessors in the New Deal had. And she's probably right. So the first New Deal, and there'll be a second one, right? 2 years later comes a second round of this stuff. But this was an avalanche of unprecedented legislation, both in scale and scope. The country had never seen anything like this before. There had been a couple of dress rehearsals for this, and a gradual move in this direction. Keep in mind, we mentioned it before, at the beginning of our class, Reconstruction, which saw the government put into place things like the Freedmen's Bureau, government programs passed by Congress, right? So federal government programs and agencies designed to help people at the everyday level in their social economic lives. That kind of legislation, social legislation, was brand new in the Reconstruction period, and we know it only lasted for a number of years. Then again, it came back in the Progressive era. The progressives, as reformers, remember, saw a huge role for government in regulating business and corporations and all kinds of other things. So this is now taking it a giant step further, but those certainly were precursors to New Deal legislation. But all these things are together as part of the New Deal, and they're all unprecedented and taken together. It's a gigantic tidal wave of legislation and government programs, the likes of which we've maybe only seen once since then. For good or bad, this was something gigantic and overall new. So one of the first ones to sort of roll out, and an important one during the 100 days, was the National Recovery Administration, headed by a businessman, politician, former military officer named Hugh Johnson. And this was seen as a centerpiece by Roosevelt and many of his brain trust and advisors. The Blue Eagle, you see in the upper left, became kind of the insignia displayed on businesses. You can see in the bottom right, restaurant employee putting up their poster kind of proudly supporting the NRA, all kinds of buttons to wear. So there was a whole PR campaign to propagandize this and sort of make it popular. And at first it was. The idea was, and this part of it went into effect, industries, their labor representatives, or the steel industry, and steel unions and their leaders, federal officials would get together industry by industry. So the steel industry does this on their own. The textile industry with government officials in on that one. Railroad industry on that one. The automotive industry here. And what they do is hammer out codes. And agree to sort of live by and adhere to the codes, and we all kind of play by the same rules in the steel industry, in the car industry. All these different companies that are used to ruthless, rugged competition with each other, they're now going to agree to cooperate in as many things as possible. Setting production codes, we're going to produce about the same amount, standardize things, set the same prices and wages, so not compete with each other in wages and prices, which is at the heart of capitalism. And you can kind of see where the criticism is going to come from, on the Republican side. And it doesn't take long for critics, mostly Republicans, not all, to say that this is socialism. And America is not a socialist country. It's a capitalist country. This is just wrong. So this is the beginning of this criticism, which will grow in volume as time goes on. As much as this was seen as a key part of the recovery of the economy, it quickly went awry. It became nearly impossible to manage, with responsibility for hundreds of codes of fair competition falling on the NRA. So there was just so much to manage. Each industry alone had so many different moving parts to it to establish, the rules of this, and that. And if you establish a rule that affects one industry, its prices and its wages, it tends to have a sort of spillover effect, ripple effect on other industries that have different codes. And so there was constant confusion and having to change things up, and it required way too much coordination of knowledge, I think, than was probably humanly possible. So this may have been impossible to succeed from the beginning, although it probably, they tried it before they realized that. Thousands of government orders directing and interpreting, again, these codes. Eventually, the NRA's work tended to benefit the biggest corporations within each industry, and so it helped them kind of move towards more monopoly-like conditions, which clearly was not the original intent, though the Roosevelt administration got criticized for that from the left as well. Socialists saying on the other side, oh, you're doing these codes, your New Deal, this National Recovery Administration, was designed just to help the biggest corporations put more money in their already rich pockets. That is the direction that the NRA moved, but it clearly wasn't what it was intended to do. It all backfired. Its motto, as you see at the top, was "We do our part." At least when hopes were still high for this extremely ambitious. This is one of those an example of Roosevelt's penchant for experimenting rather grandiosely right, and rather ambitiously. This one definitely didn't work. I'm going to go back. Where are we? Sorry. Further than I thought. Sorry. Relief, recovery, reform. So sometimes the New Deal programs and laws get separated into the 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. And it's important to know this, so I came back to it. So some of these overlapped. Some of them were 2 or all of them at one time. But I think it's still useful to separate. So relief programs, the simplest to explain, were laws, agencies, federal government, or federal government giving grants to the states to implement, but to give instant, immediate relief. Food, clothing, shelter, jobs to people in immediate danger, can't feed their families, can't pay their rent, etc. So relief programs. Recovery agencies were those that were designed to get to deal with the much harder task of getting the economy going again, getting that deflationary spiral moving in an upward direction again, and getting the economy healthy. Reforms were the first 2, relief programs and recovery laws and programs, were always designed to be temporary, just until the Depression is over. The reforms were almost always designed to be permanent, because the reforms were laws and sometimes agencies put into place at the federal level that gave the federal government an ability, if and when a future economic downturn, recession, or depression happened in the future, there'd already be programs, already be laws, already be agencies that were ready to nip it in the bud. Not necessarily stopping it, but mitigating the damage. And we'll see some of these as we go along. So our first, again, I apologize if you're getting dizzy. I don't blame you. But the NRA was essentially doing both relief and recovery at one and the same time. But it was mainly doing recovery. So it's mainly recovery that the NRA is up to. The other centerpiece of the first New Deal, can you have 2 centerpieces? Well, we're going to. I'm defying the laws of gravity, or I don't know, geometry, whatever it may be. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA. This was kind of like the agricultural counterpart to the NRA. The NRA is trying to center and sort of bring some government control and order to manufacturing and factory production of goods. And the AAA is trying to do the same thing in the countryside, in rural areas on the farms of America. Farm prices had sort of gone rock bottom. They'd even been bad in much of the 20s before the stock market crashed. And the crash and the Depression just made things worse. Farmers got hit really hard by the Great Depression. The main mechanism in the AAA was to get farmers to reduce production, meaning get them to stop planting as many crops. You're going to agree to only plant like half of your fields this year of wheat or corn or whatever it is. And of course, in order to do that, you had to pay them. So this is a strange program indeed. You're paying them to take land out of cultivation. You're paying them actually money yearly to only grow crops on part of their land. Now think about how screwed up the economy must be, and maybe even how screwed up this program is, this agency is, if people are starving, as they certainly were in the Depression, probably somewhere nearby, a place where farmers are deliberately growing less food than they're capable of. And by the same token, the Agricultural Adjustment Act also paid money to dairy, for instance, to not have as many cows and cattle for beef, which meant they slaughtered a lot of millions, I think, of hogs and cattle to keep them off the market. So wait a minute, but somebody's starving like 10 miles that way, and you're burning, slaughtering and burning without eating, having nobody eating all this cattle and hogs 10 miles this way. Talk about a broken system. So what's the point of doing this? The idea is, again, supply and demand. If there's less corn to go around, right, the price is going to be higher. It did, I think, tend to work for at least a lot of farm owners. But this is the question of who did it help in the agricultural sector of the economy? Did it harm anyone in that sector of the economy? And I think the answer is pretty clear. If you're paying the farm owners to not put all their lands into cultivation, and it does raise the prices of their corn that they do produce and sell, then they get kind of paid twice. Their prices go up because of the program, and they get a stipend from the government as well. So they get kind of two benefits from it. But who does it harm? Well, what about agricultural wage laborers who are at the bottom of the pyramid, the bottom of the economic ladder in the agricultural community? They don't even own land; they just work for a wage on land. So how does this help or harm them? Well, if a farmer that they usually work for, I don't know, harvest season, usually hires 100 people, but now with this new program, the government's paying him to take half of his land out of cultivation. Now he only needs 50 people compared to the 100 he used last year, and now 50 guys don't have their job for that part of the year because so many farmers, and it's happening all over the place, so all these farmers need less labor because they're growing less, food, fewer crops, and leaving more of their land fallow. Nothing growing on it. Another first New Deal program, the CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps. This one got lots of pub at the time and has ever since. As McIlvaine says, the most widely praised of the New Deal programs. Roosevelt took justified pride in it, and he did take pride in this one for sure. It put, this is, again, thought out by the Brain Trust and Roosevelt's New Dealers, put into play, passed Congress, Roosevelt signed into law, a program that put young men to work at $1 a day under military-type regimentation. That part got a little bit of criticism, but it gave them some discipline, which might have been good in some ways. It helped about 2.5 million young men survive the decade with a certain amount of self-respect. Right? It was a low-paying job. You had a job. You sort of had to be clean and neat, and again, sort of military type discipline. It did a lot of projects and work. So this is a government job for young men, 2.5 million of them, government paycheck every month, which would ostensibly be relief because they have a paycheck, and also recovery because they're going to spend some of that paycheck or send it home to be spent by their parents. This was supposed to be both about relief and recovery as well. As Amity Schley says, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which created parks, bridges, and roads we still enjoy today. From Wyoming, whose every county saw the introduction of projects, including the dramatic Guernsey State Park, to Greenville, Maine, whose CCC road still bears the program's name today. The Civilian Conservation Corps heartened young Americans and found a place in national memory. CCC workers planted a total of 3 billion trees across the country during the years that this was in operation in the Depression. So this is arguably one of the most, if not the most successful, and maybe the most praised of all New Deal programs. In assessing, as some of our historians are here, as we see, whether the New Deal was a success or failure, sometimes it might be best to sort of take it program by program and say, well, this one's failed, this one succeeded, this one was okay, and then sort of get a whole list and sort of see how the numbers work out. Because the NRA failed. This, it can be argued, was an overwhelming success. Around the same time, in the 100 days, avalanche of legislation and creation of federal programs and agencies, comes the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA. At its head, a young social worker, up-and-coming, very ambitious and energetic guy, Harry Hopkins. Hopkins goes on to increasingly be one of President Roosevelt's most trusted advisors. By World War II, we'll see him flying on important missions to meet with the highest officials in Great Britain and fly to the Soviet Union to meet the highest officials, including Stalin, in the Soviet Union. So Hopkins is on a meteoric rise to the top. But here he's in charge of one New Deal program, and this one gave federal grants to the states. It was a federal program, but that gave grant money to the state programs that then carried out the administration of the funds to assist those most in need of immediate assistance. So this was, again, it says it in the title, but a strictly relief program. And its initial appropriation from Congress was $500 million. Hopkins famously spent $5 million in the first 2 hours on the job, saying people don't need to eat in the long run, they eat every day. And he got criticized by some of the other New Dealers for being too much of a spendthrift. But he was passionate that these people need help, need it badly, and they need it now. And by the way, Roosevelt was both concerned about spending too much too quickly, or spending too much overall, but adamant about sort of doing these things quickly, at least at first. So he was kind of on both sides of the argument. And a guy on the other side of the argument is our next up, the head of the Public Works Administration, or the guy at least oversaw it because he was the Secretary of the Interior. So this is a cabinet minister on Roosevelt's cabinet. He was already a politician of some notoriety before. Now he's one of the key members of the administration, Harold Ickes. McIlvaine, in his really good book on the Depression, says he trusted no one and was very tight-fisted with the public's money. He saw the PWA, Public Works Administration, as a means of bringing about recovery, but also as a way to provide valuable public projects for the American people. Unlike Hopkins, he would not spend for the sake of spending or just for putting money in the pockets of the needy. The clear purpose of the PWA projects and the careful expenditures kept the agency above much of the criticism leveled at other New Deal programs. So Hopkins, sort of spending so much money, throwing it around so liberally, he drew more attention and criticism. This guy was a bit more shrewd. I'm saying Hopkins wasn't shrewd, but this guy was more shrewd, at least in this sense. He kept his expenditures sort of a bit more sort of tidy, right? Kept things a little more clean and careful, and he kind of flew under the radar a bit and didn't receive as much criticism. It became a really effective program in many ways, depending on how you measure it. Much of the spending under his tutelage, under Ickes' tutelage, went to private contractors, engineers, architects, skilled workers, and materials for production. The administration built bridges. Again, these are jobs to Americans in need of work, federal government paychecks. Again, so this is also relief and recovery. Built bridges along Key West, Florida, Causeway. Built the Grand Coulee, Boulder, and Bonneville dams. Built the Triborough Bridge in New York City. About 70% of new education buildings in the U.S. Throughout the decade. Hospitals, sewage systems, port facilities, municipal buildings, etc., sidewalks, etc., streets. So they got a lot of things built. And because, again, it was sort of practical things that were being done here with the money, and because he was careful with the expenditure, he didn't get as much criticism and got lots of praise, at least from some. Another hugely ambitious project was the TVA, or Tennessee Valley Authority, and you can see a map here. It mainly was in the state of Tennessee, but it bled over into a lot of neighboring states as well, Mississippi, Alabama, etc. It was led by another major New Deal figure, David Lilienthal, who went on to sort of bigger and higher things through the World War and after as well. But as Gene Smiley in a book called Rethinking the Depression has said, the reform measures also extended to utilities, arguing that the federal government's 1920s investment in flood control and navigation in the Muscle Shoals area of the Tennessee River had not been utilized Roosevelt asked Congress to establish the Tennessee Valley Authority to build dams that would harness the river's nearly annual floods while supplying electricity to the region. The TVA would also provide a yardstick by which to measure the performance of the private, investor-owned electric utilities, meaning the corporate-owned utilities, and then to determine the regulation. So by the government kind of going into the utility business itself, it can kind of gauge what the corporations sort of could afford and could not afford, and sort of be a better sort of watchdog over them. At the same time, it is providing jobs as well for relief, because building dams isn't going to happen overnight. So it's a not necessarily a permanent job, but a long-term job, and it's also providing paychecks for those federal workers working on these things over a fairly long haul. And it's providing cheap electricity, at least to those areas. All the little red blotches there are either dams or TVA facilities of one sort or another. So that's a lot of jobs, a lot of work, a lot of effort there. This one got enormous criticism from Republicans and conservatives as well, since this is government-owned electricity and utilities, at least in the dark green area there. Once again, the obvious criticism, socialism. Right, and so this was something that the Republicans kind of kept going back to again and again and again. President Roosevelt, by the way, always deeply resented being called a socialist, as he was increasingly and again. From his, and it's possible to make that argument, yeah, of course, but from his point of view, and it's possible to make his argument as well, his viewpoint was, what you ungrateful capitalists and supporters of capitalism, I saved capitalism. It was dying on the vine, and I came around with my programs and resuscitated and revived it and kept it alive to live another day and to become healthy again. You guys should be grateful that I saved capitalism, and instead you call me a socialist. That was his legitimate, that was what he really believed. And so it really bothered him that he got called a socialist. Another feature well known today of the first New Deal is the Glass-Steagall or Banking Act of 1933, which was in place until 1999, when the Congress repealed it and President Clinton signed the repeal into law, eliminating Glass-Steagall. And there's been a bevy of political leaders, economists, I'm not saying all, but there's been a bevy that have been adamant that we need, that this country and its economy needs a new Glass-Steagall Act or something like it back again. What it did after the disaster of bank collapses in the Great Depression, or at the beginning of the Depression, it established the Federal Deposit Insurance Fund, which we mentioned a little bit earlier, but it also, just as importantly, at least later on, established the separation of commercial and investment banking, so that if you a commercial bank is the kind that we're used to. We put our money in savings accounts, checking accounts, go to get loans. An investment bank, most of us, unless we're super filthy rich, don't usually deal with. Investment banks don't handle individual bank accounts. They sort of do mergers and acquisitions. They market and put together packages of corporate bonds. So they do a lot of things for the corporate world, and so they're not banks in the same sense usually that we think of them today. But both before Glass-Steagall and since its repeal in 1999, banks can be both. And one of the problems with it, at least according to its critics, and I've been one of them over the years, is, and you can see this in sort of the bottom. These, of course, are new pictures or graphics here, but that investment banks tend to speculate. That's not all they do, but they tend to not only market bonds and sell them and broker them, but they also tend to kind of buy and sell and wheel and deal in bonds and other these days increasingly sophisticated financial mechanisms, financial instruments. And because of that, there's a lot of risk. Speculation is kind of like gambling. And so when you have a investment bank, right, if it's not a commercial bank, because it can't be, then okay, it can make some risky investments and kind of roll the dice in stocks and bonds and If it doesn't work out, the bank crashes, no big deal. But if investment banks and commercial banks can be linked and be one and the same, that means that all the risky stuff it's doing in this kind of gambling casino investment bank side, that's not all it does, but it's a lot of it. You'd be surprised if you don't know this already. That means if that goes bad, the speculation part in the lower right, you see there was smoke and fire. It means it affects the everyday economy and the everyday people like you and me that have our money in that same bank on the commercial side of the bank. So in my view, it was a good idea in the New Deal. This was a piece of legislation I think that worked and was well thought out. That this put up a firewall between commercial and investment banks. But it also established the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Fund. William Lichtenberg, I've quoted him many times now, says it was motivated in part by a recognition of the anguish of the small depositor, but also by the conviction that the safety fund device would protect the circulating medium and would help sustain a system of small unit banks. Roosevelt frowned on it, but recognized that the demand for federal bank insurance could not be resisted. So that quote is just attesting to the first part of it, the Federal Deposit Insurance Fund or Corporation, which you see today, right? You go into a bank, and you look around, you'll see Federal FDIC, and they guarantee your money up to, what is it now, $250,000, or is it higher than that now? I forget. Which means if you have money in that bank up to that limit, if the bank crashes and collapses, the federal government, out of its own FDIC fund, will reimburse your money. So up to $250,000 or whatever it's gone up to now, you're protected. If you have more than that, that part's not protected. But up to that much money, your savings account, checking account is supposed to be protected. Now, clearly there can't be a fund big enough that if every single person, right, lost their money because every single bank went out of business on the same day, that the government could pay that back. There's no way. First of all, it's not likely to happen. But secondly, it also shows you that that's not the main purpose of Federal Deposit Insurance Fund. The purpose mainly is to keep people from panicking. And so if they see, oh, I've got the FDIC there, okay, I don't need to do, right? What did we see before, earlier in the lecture today? Assuming you watched this in one piece, you may not have, but we saw that there were bank runs at the beginning of the Depression, or just before this, actually, in a couple of years previously. People lined up around the corner to get their money out of the bank, and their very act of taking the money out of the bank, one after another, is in the end what caused the bank to collapse. So this program is designed to prevent that, or help prevent it, by keeping people from saying, I don't need to go and stand in line at the bank because I'm protected. If the bank goes under, the insurance coming from the federal government will back it up. So I think this idea was pretty sound as well. And this is a classic reform. The fact that it's still with us tells you that, because remember, the reforms were designed to, one, mitigate damage if a future economic crisis happened again, and two, they're meant to be permanent, and this is still there. So Glass-Steagall Banking Act of 33 is a good example of the relief, recovery, reform, the reform part of the New Deal. In 1934 came the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, which is also still with us and is also a reform and was also designed to try to help prevent or mitigate an future economic crisis again. This was the federal government's first attempt, and I guess it's still around, ever, of regulating financial markets. As Maclay says, the Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate the stock market and limit the kind of speculative transactions that it was thought had led to the crash of 1929. The Federal Housing Administration was created to ensure bank loans for the construction and repair of houses, thus boosting the recovery of both building and mortgage banking. So not just the stock exchange, a stock market, but a number of elements of finance were now getting sort of the watchdog eye and attention of the federal government. At the bottom left, you see the photograph of the first 5 members of the board of the SEC, and in the center, it's chairman, Joseph P. Kennedy. And this is an interesting story. In the upper left, you see the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. But when the president announced that Joseph P. Kennedy would be heading the Securities and Exchange Commission, people went crazy. Even members of his own party, his own allies on the Democratic side of the aisle, because Kennedy was a very well-known, extremely wealthy and successful businessman from Massachusetts, but one who was known for being a little bit shady. At least that was sort of the reputation. In the 1920s, for instance, when the dry decade, when Prohibition was in effect, it appears that he was sort of making money by investing in a bootleg whiskey and alcohol. So he had a tendency to sometimes sort of cross lines. And because he had that reputation, it's like, wait a minute, Roosevelt is now putting him in charge of the federal government agency that's supposed to watch for cheating and fraud on the stock market. And one politician angry about this called this setting a wolf to guard a flock of sheep. And many critics saw it that way. Kennedy, however, may have been, FDR, the president, may have been kind of shrewd here because he may have realized that Joseph Kennedy was a bit shady, and his approach may have been, you know what, who better to catch a thief than a thief? It's probably true that Joseph Kennedy knew some of the tricks of how to manipulate the stock market, and so, because he probably done it himself. So that might have been, now there might have been a method to Roosevelt's madness in this situation, but it drew a huge amount of fire. By the way, some of you may know this, but Joseph P. Kennedy, being the chair of the SEC is pretty high, but he later was appointed by the same President Roosevelt to become ambassador to Great Britain just before World War II, which lifted him even higher in politics after having an incredibly successful career in business. But what he's most famous for today, by far, is having kids. Because a son of his became President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. Another son became Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy. And a third one, Ted Kennedy, was a lion, a titan in the Senate for decades. So this is the patriarch of the famous Kennedy clan that's still around today. He's the guy that basically started the whole thing, meaning the family on the road to wealth and power. And his ambitions were frustrated. He didn't stay ensconced as ambassador to Britain for very long because he had a falling out, series of major disagreements with President Roosevelt over how to deal with Great Britain and the situation in Europe with Hitler rising to power. And so in a fairly short time, Roosevelt fired him and yanked him out of that position, which basically ended his political career. He's still a rich guy, and so that's probably part of the reason that he started telling his sons, "You're going to go into politics." And he started telling people pretty early after the war was over that my son Jack, or John F. Kennedy, is going to be President of the United States. And as rich and powerful as he'd been, he would, yeah, whatever, right, sure, your son's going to be president. But of course, he did become president. So this guy was an important figure in his own day, but he's most famous for the more powerful sons that he had.